Good morning, everyone. This is Michelle Young, the Executive Director of the University Council for Educational Administration, and I'm here today with the UCEA webinar series on educational leadership. Our webinar series, which is co-sponsored by UCEA and the Wallace Foundation, continues today with a discussion of the University Preparation Program Initiative, Implications for Education Leadership Field. Now, over the last 2 decades, evidence has demonstrated that leadership is critically important to school improvement and school success. And researchers have been able to identify the key leadership activities that are strongly associated with student learning, teacher effectiveness, and school improvement. Furthermore, in recent years, our understanding of the role of ed leadership preparation in supporting effective leadership has also grown. And compared to decades ago, we know much more today about the features of effective leadership preparation and the role that preparation plays in effective leadership practice. A significant amount of the research-based knowledge in these 2 areas has been supported by the Wallace Foundation, and we're pleased to have Jody Spiro, the Director of Education Leadership for the Foundation, as our guest today. In addition to the leadership that Jody provides for the Wallace Foundation, she's also served in a number of positions focused on leadership and change, including Senior Assistant to the New York City Schools Chancellor, Director of Principals Professional Development at the New York City Board of Education, Planning Officer for the Board of Trustees at Long Island University, and Director of Education at the Education Development Center's Office of Global Learning. Since joining the Wallace Foundation in 2002, Jody has committed her professional life to excellence in education leadership practice and preparation. In addition to the work that she has provided through her leadership of the foundation, she has also authored 2 books, Leading Change Step by Step, Tactics, Tools, and Tales, High Payoff Strategies on How Education Leaders Get Results. These are both published by Josie Bass. Jody will be talking with us today about a new Wallace Foundation initiative focused on university principal preparation, as well as the projects and research findings that led to the foundation to make this important investment. Toward the end of today's webinar, we will be opening up the discussion to questions. However, we encourage you to share your questions as they occur to you. You can do this in a couple of different ways. First, you could submit questions in the question box or in the chat box. You could also tweet them with the hashtag UPPI webinar. That's hashtag UPPI webinar. Finally, if you miss any of today's webinar, never fear. We will be highlighting today's discussion with Jody Spiro on UCEA's YouTube channel. So without further ado, let's begin. Welcome, Jody. We're so pleased to have you join us today.
Thanks so much, Michelle. And I think, one thing that Michelle might have mentioned is her own engagement in Wallace's education leadership work. And Michelle, you were one of the first people I met when I joined the foundation in 2002. You were on the National Advisory Committee way back when, and so you've been really helpful to the foundation throughout our journey in education leadership. You've been a major advisor to that work. So Truth in Advertising, Michelle and I have had a relationship that goes back some 13, 14 years.
Yes, and I can't express how thrilled I am that we're at the point where we're having this conversation today, where we're going to talk essentially about the different things that Wallace has supported over the years, the major findings from that work, and how all of that led to how we got to now. And that is where the Wallace Foundation is making a significant investment in university principal preparation programs. In fact, that work, that almost a decade and a half of investment in education leadership preparation is one of the reasons why we wanted to have an opportunity to talk to Jody today. And we've asked her to talk about 4 things. in particular. First of all, to tell us a little bit about the Wallace Foundation and its investment in educational leadership. Some of the things that Jody, in particular, as the Director of Education Leadership, believes have been some of the essential contributions that the Foundation has made in this area. We'd also like for her to talk about a most recent report that they've put together called The Landscape of University Principal Preparation Programs and the role it played in helping leadership at the Wallace Foundation make the decision to invest in the University Preparation Program Initiative. So Jody, let's begin with a little background on the Foundation.
Okay, terrific. And, you know, in preparation for the webinar, as Michelle asked me, you know, what is a perspective then and now from the early beginnings in 2002, and so I just have mused on that as a little bit of an introduction to this. But when my third day on the job, I was asked to attend an advisory committee meeting where I believe you were, Michelle, and there were maybe 20 of the nation's, you know, most important thought leaders in education. And remember, I was brand new at Wallace. I had left a really good job to come here, and one by one, people around the table kept saying that the foundation got it wrong, that education leadership, which was a brand new initiative at the time, was a, quote, tertiary issue at best. And you can imagine how delighted I was to hear that on my third day here. And so but that became my perspective about education leadership. I mean, we've come from a tertiary issue to now today, and especially with the new Every Student Succeeds Act, a real recognition of the importance of leaders, principals, assistant principals, principal supervisors in, you know, as essential to improving education for students, particularly those with the highest needs. And so it's been an incredible journey, and we are nowhere near finished with it. As a matter of fact, as Michelle said, we are embarking on a whole new phase that we'll talk about today. So with the next slide, we will just say a bit about the Wallace Foundation. I think most of you know us, but the mission is to foster improvements in learning and enrichment for disadvantaged children and ensure the vitality of the arts for everyone. But our approach is to work with our grantee partners to develop and then share evidence-based insights that come from the on-the-ground research. And a big goal of ours is to make sure, to the best we can, that people who never get a grant from Wallace, in fact, benefit from the lessons that Wallace learns. So for us, it's a real balance. If we look at the next slide, it's a real balance between funding work and learning lessons. And so this is how we think about it. We think about it as a cycle. If we click once, we're going to get the first part of that cycle, which is understanding the context. So it's really important for us as a national foundation sitting in an office in New York City. It's super important for us that we always have a thorough grounding of the needs of the field. And in that case, as Michelle talked about before, with the landscape report that we put together from surveys that UCEA did, as well as other surveys that AACTE did and AASA, We'll get to all those alphabet soup acronyms in a little while, but the idea is we don't take for granted that we know what's on the mind of leaders in the field, and we make sure that before we begin anything, we understand what people in the field want to know, and we have a very, quote, scientific way to assess this. We ask the question, what is it that we don't know that if we knew it would lead to a breakthrough? And so we generate, if you click again, please, thank you, we generate what we call a high leverage knowledge question. What is it that we don't know that if we knew it would lead to a breakthrough? And then we fund various states, districts, nonprofits, associations to help us learn those lessons, usually over a 4 or 5 year period of time, and have them evaluated by an external third-party evaluation. And then when we have those lessons, if we click twice, we want to catalyze broad impact, again, going back to trying to improve policy and practice nationwide, so people who, we not only improve our grants and our facilitated professional learning communities, not only improve the practice in the places we fund, but throughout the country. And then with that last arrow, we go and do it all again. So during the course of one initiative, we very often have questions that lead to an initiative. So on the next slide, a very brief summary how over the last 16 years, we've worked in 26 states, 28 major urban districts, resulting in over 90 research reports with downloads on our website last year of 677,000. So for us, it's not about measuring visitors, it's about measuring downloads. So people are actually reading the lessons and hopefully incorporating into their work. The other thing that we do, which we find fascinating, is we keep in touch with those folks who've gotten Wallace grants in the past, particularly those from what we call our first generation, which were the first 10 years. And we find out what they've actually managed to sustain. And this year is the 5th year for those programs, the 5th year of receiving no Wallace funds, and this has resulted in 108 of their training programs mostly having been sustained, which represents 73% of what they started in the Wallace work. So 73%, although we don't have a lot to compare it to, but we think it's a pretty high number for what's been sustained. And as those of you who've worked with us know, we put a premium on sustainability. We're always learning about, collectively with our grantees, about how work is effectively sustained. So sure, Michelle, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking that the last time we had you as a guest on one of our webinar, we were talking about this issue of sustainability in these different programs that were supported by grants, and we'll make sure that we post that webinar for folks who are interested in following up on that.
Well, I think the findings are really important, and one that I would highlight for our audience today is this major finding which carries over into the university principal prep initiative, that the #1 factor for sustaining the training programs in those districts in which we work, the #1 factor for sustaining is partnerships with universities. And I don't think we can overstate the importance of district-university partnerships. In one case where a new superintendent came in and decided not to fund the district's programs, but they were already sustained within the partner universities. So the programs were sustained, just not at the district, but by the universities. And so since the last time we talked about it, Michelle, it may be partnerships were always very high up there, but now they are number one. And so, again, very strongly built into the work that we're about to talk about with the university principal prep initiative. So thanks for bringing that up, because that's a very key point. If we go to our next topic that Michelle said we would talk about, we don't want to take for granted that everybody knows why this work is so important. So very briefly, well, you know, we all know how important it is, but as Ed Pauley always says, our director of research and evaluation, Ed always says that the best research is that which confirms what you already know. And so I think we've spent lots of years getting research which confirms what everyone who's on this webinar knows, but now everybody knows it and there's evidence for it. So the next slide, just some of our evidence why leadership is key to student learning. I think we've all used this phrase that it's second only to classroom instruction among all school-related factors. There's a little further, you know, it's, the researchers have said that 30% roughly of factors related to student achievement is by teachers, and 25% has been attributed to principals. However, the last bullet on this page indicates how even more important principals are than that principals, according to Paul Manna, are the multipliers of effective teaching. So principals have influence in and of themselves, but they also have the school-wide influence to be multipliers of effective teaching, to influence the school culture and everything that goes on within the school building. So a disproportionately high level of influence. Next slide will tell us that principals are also key to retaining good teachers. And I think we've all seen the various surveys, whether from MetLife or whether from Gallup, but in particular here we call out Linda Darling-Hammond's work in her 2007 Preparing School Leaders for a Changing World. It comes out all the time that the number one reason that teachers give for staying in their schools or for leaving their schools, but you know, in order for teachers to be retained in high-need schools, it's the quality of the principal. And this, I need to point out, this is the number one factor, including money. Money is not the number one factor for good teachers being retained. The number one factor above money is the principal of the school. And so on the next slide, another key point is that when states and districts are looking, and foundations are looking for cost-effective strategies, you know, as we all know, there are about 100,000 principals in the country, and there are 4 million teachers in the country. So doing the math, it's a lot more cost-effective to have effective principals who then work with and do PD for teachers. So improve, and it's actually one of the things we've spoken with Michelle about and with Steve Tozier about, that it is actually a realistic goal to think about improving the preparation and performance of 100,000 principals is actually a realistic goal. However, the next slide will show us that good leaders are hard to find. And so one of the lessons that Wallace learned early on, as we have about half the superintendents in the country saying that they have difficulty finding principals for their vacancies. And so way back in 2003, Wallace did a synthesis called Beyond the Pipeline of several reports and found out what we all know to be the case now, but it was news then, that there's no shortage of certified principals. There are a lot of people around with the credential, but the shortage is of qualified principals. So the goal has to go well beyond certifying people to the quality of those people who complete preparation. And the good news on the next slide is that good leaders can be developed. You know, I would just guess that everybody who's on this webinar at some time or other has been challenged, as I have been, with the question of, are good leaders born or can they be developed? And yes, it's a career-threatening question, because if good leaders can't be developed, then what are we all doing here? So the good news is that good leaders can be developed, and again, Linda Darling-Hammond's report that documents that graduates of effective programs are better prepared. They're particularly better prepared for high-need schools. And interestingly enough, from Linda's report, that leaders who graduate from effective programs are twice as likely to actually become principals. One of the things that we've learned that all of you already knew, it took Wallace some additional years to learn it, is well, we're very good at continuous learning, Michelle, and we think we really like to be open to new lessons and revise what we're doing as we learn. One of the things we've learned from our Principal Pipeline Initiative, where 6 major urban districts are developing this pipeline, which includes standards, it includes pre-service partnerships with their university providers, it includes hiring criteria, and it includes on-the-job evaluation and PD and mentoring for principals in their first 3 to 5 years. And one of the things we learned there was how few people actually become principals after they graduate from their prep programs. And, in a place like Hillsborough in Tampa, Florida, it can take somebody more than 6 years after their graduation from the preparation program to become principals. So it's pretty significant, particularly in that light, that Linda's report found that graduates of effective programs, that 60% of them ultimately become principals, as opposed to 20 or 30% from other programs. So that finding is actually, I understand that finding better now to be even more important. And so when we say effective programs, on the next slide, this synthesis document that Wallace prepared in 2012 takes all these various, we said there are over 90 reports on our website, but the good news for everybody is that every once in a while we make a synthesis of them. And so you don't have to read 90 reports, but this synthesized report from 2012 does talk about the characteristics of high-quality leader prep programs that, in fact, are drawn from the whole variety of reports that Wallace commissioned. And I don't think any of these are big surprises to the folks on the webinar, but as I said earlier, it's very useful when research confirms what we already know. So the selective recruitment of candidates, when possible, not self-selection, but a real nomination and vetting process for those to enter the program, the focus on improving instruction, not just on building management, internships where candidates actually lead instructional work, the collaboration with districts so that the graduates of the programs meet the needs of the specific districts that hire them. You'll see this a lot with the state using its power to set standards for program accreditation aligns with what districts and universities consider to be high quality. So this alignment between the licensure criteria of principals and the accreditation criteria, which may sound pretty simple, but I think we all know it does not happen very often. And then in the principal's early years on the job, to have this quality mentoring, I think one of the things we've learned from the principal pipeline work that was not entirely intuitive for everybody was that preparation does not end with graduating from the program and getting the job. That preparation really extends to the first several years on the job for principals. And the last thing that I want to say about this is just I want to comment, Michelle, on the tie-in with ESSA and the Every Student Succeeds Act that we're all aware of. But to know that the RAND Corporation has recently completed an evidence scan that's on our website. I would encourage everybody on this webinar to take a look at it. It's volume 1. It looks at what's the evidence in the field in education leadership that corresponds with the evidence requirements of ESSA, particularly under Title I, the tiered evidence that's required. And the good news there is that RAND found many reports, research reports, that that would qualify different activities to be eligible for funding by states and districts under Title I with the tiered evidence, tiers 1 through 3. And what that, in particular, of importance for the audience today is that there is evidence of the effectiveness of leader preparation and of leader professional development. And so both those areas of activity are areas eligible for funding under Title I, where I think everybody knows that states and districts not only are creating plans for Title I spending, but also for school improvement plan spending, now that starting in 2017, the SIG program is devolved, in the language that's used, devolved to the states. So the whole area of principal prep and principal PD is pretty newly opened up to Title I and to school improvement. Did want to get that in. And yeah. So Michelle, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I was going to say thanks for bringing that up. It's something that I know that the UCA audience has been very interested in learning more about. And we did share the RAND report, but if anybody missed that particular communication, as Jody mentioned, it's posted on the Wallace Foundation website, and we'll probably be promoting it again within the next few weeks.
And it's worth knowing as well that this is the first of 2 reports. The second one is going to come out in October, and it will deal more in depth with Tier 4 and Title II. The reason that RAND started with Tiers 1 through 3 is because there was a question in the minds of the Department of Ed and others as to whether, in fact, there was sufficient evidence in education leadership to justify funding under Title I, and the good news answer to that is yes, there is. Then, Michelle, going to what is the heart of the webinar, if we can go
yes.
2 slides.
So yeah. I just had a few follow-up sure. questions and comments before we move up to that. So, in terms of context, Jody had a really difficult job in highlighting those particular pieces, because I had asked her to give us a sense of what brought the foundation to the decision around the university preparation program, but then also to really highlight the pieces of research that are of most significance. And she noted that they've funded hundreds of projects and have presented over 90 reports that are available on their website. So to be able to consolidate the kind of the big takeaways to just a few is not an easy task. And each one of these reports, I think, make a really strong argument, kind of the moving from leadership matters to student learning and school effectiveness to leadership matters in terms of having and retaining good teachers to it's important that we're improving preparation because it's a cost-effective strategy that yes, preparation actually does work. You can develop good leaders. And the fact that, quality preparation matters because there are quite a few folks out there who have certification that may or may not be coming from high quality programs. And then finally, to be able to get a sense of, what exactly does a good program look like and how is it distinguishable from programs that may not be as effective. And I'd say that particular piece of work has been very important for the UCEA community. We have had a number of complementary research projects and publication efforts that have complemented the work that Darlene Hammond did, and certainly her work really raised awareness in a significant way about the features of effective leadership preparation. And just so that the UCEA community is aware, in 2009, UCEA published the first handbook of research on the education of school leaders that included a gap analysis. In 2016, in November, we'll be introducing the second edition of that handbook. And for better or for worse, the gaps have not completely closed. And so over a few years, we will continue some efforts to develop some research projects that help us get a better sense of what the innards of some of those effective program features look like and what kind of impact they have on their graduates once they have positions within schools, either as teacher leaders or assistant principals or principals, etc. But that definitely does lead us to the next part of our webinar, which is thinking about where programs are, and in particular those that are interested in doing redesign. Jody?
Sure, thank you. There's so much to say. Isn't it wonderful how much there is to say? So on the next slide, so again, in the work that Wallace has been doing, when I mentioned how one question begets another question begets another question, and so the trajectory that we've been on is in our first generation, again for 10 years from 2000 to 2010, the question really was as elementary as, do leaders matter, right? And with the research that we've done, that UCEA has done, we've hopefully, we have to keep putting it out there, but hopefully that question has been satisfactorily answered, that people really get that. But in our principal pipeline work, which began in 2011 that I described earlier, and stay tuned for 2018 when we actually have the correlation data, the impact study of student achievement for principals who've come through the pipeline of high quality programs and been in their schools for at least 3 years to actually make it fair. And our principal supervisor initiative, that began in 2014 and is still going strong in 8 districts. But the idea, that the question that keeps emerging is, if you ever really want to have scale, if you ever really want to have nationwide change, that, going back to that first slide that I showed you at the beginning, there is no other way to do it than to be working with the universities and to be working with the states. And so, although Wallace continues our work with districts, where the rubber does meet the road, as the consumers, the people who hire the graduates, but there is no way to influence the entire field without working with the universities and the states. And so this is, we commissioned these four simultaneous landscape studies that you see on the screen that resulted in the report whose cover you see on the right. And, you know, I guess I would just begin this short discussion by disclaiming that you're not going to necessarily find your university program in here, that these are, we were looking to take away the high-level trends that we were finding across all universities, not just UCEA universities, and the districts as well. And so on the next slide, we're going to just give you the 5 really high-level themes that came through, which was really interesting, that having surveyed the superintendents across the country and having surveyed all different kinds of universities across the country, that the district leaders said, as we talked about earlier, that they have difficulty finding principals in particular, because we were asking about principals who were, you know, job ready day one. But the interesting point was that many of the universities also believed that their programs had room for improvement. And again, when all the universities were taken together, UCEA and AACTE, what people said was more than about, I think it was about 50-something% of the universities said that they had either redesigned within the last couple of years or were looking to redesign. And, you know, Michelle, one of the things I didn't say that either one of us might have said is that the job of the principal has changed during all this time. You know, there's been this recognition of the importance of the principal, but Paul Manna writes about this in his report from 2015, especially, that the job of the principal has changed, and it's much more around, there was a lot of lip service given to instruction and being a change agent in the past, but a lot of the job was around boilers, buses, and whatever the other B is, business, I don't know, but you know, the job of the principal has changed, which I think is a particular impetus for why universities may feel that their programs need to change. And another report, Michelle, that UCEA did for Wallace a few years ago, which talked about the important impact of the national voluntary standards as a driver of change for preparation programs. And, you know, hopefully, I'm assuming everybody on the webinar knows that there are now new voluntary standards, the PSEL, the Professional Education Leader Standards, that, Michelle, I know you were heavily involved with last year. And so even just as a minor example, but even just the calling up of equity as a new standard that was not there before. So just in keeping up with the job of the principal in these changing times would be reason enough for university programs to feel that that some sort of redesign is almost a continuous improvement kind of thing really necessary.
Yeah, I'd say that that's a very typical perspective among UCEA institutions, is this notion that improvement is something that is an ongoing thing, not something that you put up on the shelf. So it's a very good point. And I think, you know, the faculty are very much aware, too, of the changes within the principalship position. And I think that there's a real welcome for the new PSEL and the forthcoming NELP standards that are a fairly good step forward from ISLIC, which didn't really change much between 1996 and 2008, but it certainly has made some interesting additions, important additions with the PSEL. So yes, absolutely.
And so perhaps we'll briefly cover, next slide please, we'll cover the other 5, which I don't think will be news to anybody, but again, great to have it documented. So the importance of the university district partnership, everybody said that, and both on the district side as well as on the university side. However, it's interesting to me because although they are really perceived, the partnerships are really perceived as being super important, but most universities, most districts said, that there's just a long way to go in living this out. So this is a big need on both sides. The next.
It really is, and Jody, it's kind of one of those areas which I think is ripe for a research project of some kind, because even within university programs in UCEA that have partnerships, where there's a wide variety in terms of the definition of what that means or what the activities involve. I think that the work that SREB did for Wallace back in the 2000s, where they were identifying, a continuum of different types of partnerships that involved engagement in creating the curriculum, delivery of the curriculum, selection of candidates, a whole variety of different things. Some programs have certain aspects, and then some, have all of them, and then some have very few. And it is curious as to how and why that occurs, and what might be a helpful support. So I know that this is a key element within your forthcoming project. So I'm hoping that the UCA programs and others can learn from this project, but then also it certainly would be something that UCA would invite its members to consider thinking about in terms of a pretty strong research project.
It's quite interesting. One of the districts that participates in the Principal Pipeline Initiative was having difficulty engaging with university partners at the beginning of their work. And they actually did a social marketing survey of the area universities to ask the university programs why they were reluctant to partner with the district. And when you talk about a research project, this was a really interesting market research project. And the data came back to the district that all the universities found it extraordinarily difficult to work with this district, and they'd rather work with other districts because they found the point of entry to be difficult. They found there was not one person they could deal with. They didn't, and once the district knew this, the district, it was a pretty easy thing for the district to, in fact, provide for the potential university partners all these things. Here's your central point of contact. Here's the the openness to co-constructing curriculum and so forth. And now that district has 7 university partners. And what's interesting to what you were saying is each university partner has a different role in terms of preparation and PD within the district. So it's not like 7 university programs competing against each other. But it all began because of the market research, which I thought was a pretty fascinating thing. So in addition, we had three other big findings. Next slide, please. That the course of study doesn't always reflect the principal's jobs. I think this and again, a lot of these highlights get addressed by the university district collaboration. So, but even on the state level, as I mentioned before, let's say in Illinois, as they were going through this major rehaul of the state regs, the one thing they have later said that they didn't do, that they had to catch up and then do, was the alignment between the accreditation of the preparation programs and the licensure requirements. So those two really need to be in sync and really need to reflect the job of the principals on the ground.
Jody, would you say that, so I think that most people would agree that the PSEL standards that were just released do a better job of reflecting current principals' jobs. And I know that there's been some conversation about, how long it will take for states to update their own state standards to somehow reflect PSEL, as well as think about their certification requirements and whether or not the ETS's SLLA will be aligned to PSEL in the near future. Can you give any insight into anything that the Wallace Foundation might know about those types of issues? I know that the TCSSO is a partner, and
yeah, and a lot of this also, there's again a lot of interplay with the new work with ESSA too. So one thing I know is that as of, because it's such a moving target, which is what's funny, right? So this landscape study was completed before the new PSEL standards. So it's catching up with all this is definitely a full-time job. Challenge accepted. But I've been told that 8 states have already adopted the new PSEL standards, so that's good. And there is an interactive map that AIR has done under that CCSSO umbrella for the PSEL about what standards each state currently has in place. And Wallace our board just approved a grant to AIR to update that interactive map for the standards and also the accreditation standards that the state has for university prep programs, and also any existing leader evaluation programs. So that should be done in a few months. So that interactive map, I think, is really helpful. I think that the work with aligning the principal prep with the licensure, with the work on the ground, and then aligning all of it with the state's Title I and Title II plans under ESSA is the big package. And one of the things that our board just approved us to do is to create some ongoing work that pulls it all together and use 6 states as laboratories. So starting in September, we are actually going to convene national groups, and UCEA will be among them, of course, and then but have working groups in 6 states that will pull together the new ESSA just on ed leadership, that will pull together the ESSA requirements, the accreditation requirements, and the work in the large urban districts. In addition, pulling in the National Urban League affiliates. So we're really trying to lead a facilitate a process that brings all these groups together to try to integrate all the ed leadership work on the state level. I think there's now that we have so many of these projects out there, that's great, but I think, coordination is going to start to be the order of the day, so that they're not just isolated projects, but that that they have an impact, a collective impact. Was that what you wanted me to talk about, Michelle?
Yeah, I know that that was a bit of a rabbit trail there, but I think it was a very helpful and productive one. Thank you. It's perfect.
Okay, thanks. So the next slide, I think if people were not muted, we would be hearing hysterical laughter because they did not need a landscape study to tell us that there are policies at the university level and practices that hinder change. So I will let that speak for itself. I think everyone on the webinar is all too familiar with that. And then the last one here on the landscape, the next slide, please, that we've already talked about, that the states have the authority to help programs improve, but I think the big finding here is that not many states are actively using it. And the landscape study found some 13 states that had policies that were supportive of accreditation changes and preparation programs. That, so the good news is there are 13, and the bad news is there are only 13. So then the last slide in this section, if we can go to it, the next slide, please, is that UCEA with new leaders has produced a wonderful tool for states to be able to assess where they are in terms of the accreditation process, where they are and where they need to go, and then it gives them the tools to be able to do that. And we actually use this as part of our request for proposals for our new initiative, so that states knew what they were getting into in terms of the level and the type of change that's required to bring this about. Although, of course, Wallace does not prescribe to states what they should do, but here is kind of the landscape, what states might be doing, and then tools for them to do it. So we consider this document by UCEA and new leaders to be a really high quality document that is really of a lot of use to states. And so just in conclusion of this part, this just leads to how we got to our university initiative, that collective action for redesigning prep programs for building stronger connections between universities and districts, and trying to ensure that state policies support the redesign of programs to meet those high bar standards. And the last slide on this section, that there's a lot to build on, as you can see from everything we've said, that there are many high quality programs out there and an interest in redesign. Districts are interested in partnering. I think there's a long way to go to effective partnerships, as Michelle said, but the interest is there. And there are several states, and the 13 in particular, that other states can learn from. And the bird walk that we took on ESSA, hopefully we will be continuing to learn more lessons as states are facilitated in these processes, and there can be more exemplars. So should we, Michelle, just go on to spend just a few minutes on the new initiative? Would that be a good idea?
Yes, and then we can get to a few questions on these.
Okay, great. So I told you we always do this high leverage knowledge question, which is on the next slide. So we're seeking to learn here how university principal prep programs working with high need school districts, exemplary programs, and the state can improve their training to reflect the evidence on how to best prepare effective principals. That's what we don't know, that if we knew it, could lead us to a breakthrough. And so the next slide is the design of this initiative. And what it shows you is that there are we'll have either 6 or 7 university programs, and they will manage partnerships with at least one exemplary program. Several of those programs are UCEA members, and with at least three school districts. In some cases where they're rural school districts, it's not 3 districts per se, but in some cases it's a consortium of large numbers of urban districts. And then in the middle, you see that there's, first of all, you see that the whole thing is a bubble that is within the policy framework. And then in the middle of this, you see that there's technical assistance, which will be provided by UCEA and a couple of others. And then there's this professional learning community where we will all be learning these lessons together. The 2 bullets on the bottom, that there is a third-party evaluation, as there always is, for us to learn lessons that are more broadly applicable, and that we do have plans that in addition to our professional learning community, which is for those universities that are redesigning and their partner programs, but twice within the 5 years of this initiative, we plan to have large-scale conferences for universities and states which are not involved directly in the program, so that those lessons can in fact be shared more broadly. Even though they'll be up on our website, there'll be an opportunity to attend conferences and engage in person. So I guess I would just end, because we can take the rest on questions. The next slide is just to say what's it called, a large-scale, hairy, audacious goal is. Our goal, why we're trying to do this. This is kind of a summary that, we had our first generation work, and it's all leading to what we are hoping is going to be a new norm for principal preparation, not through this one UPPI initiative, but over the next 10 or 15 years. The fact that we say more as we know more is our mantra here at Wallace, and in ed leadership, we feel like we really have the evidence to support the redesign of prep. And so our first generation work led to programs in states and districts. Our principal pipeline work is, among other things, has provided us with lots of rich examples about university district partnerships, leading us to the thought that, in fact, we think, and the landscape analysis has confirmed that people are by and large ready for large-scale university principal prep, which, again, a few years from now, we hope leads to a new norm for principal preparation. So our goal is nothing less than that, and it's noon, and so I just want to acknowledge that we've brought this in on the hour's time frame, and now we're happy to engage Michelle and I back and forth with your questions.
Yes, thanks so much, Jody. We wanted to start with just sort of a general question about the UPPI program, and so lots of curiosity, as you might imagine, about kind of what specifically you all have in mind for some of these activities for the different preparation programs. And I thought it might be helpful for you just to share a little bit about how the programs aren't like a one-size-fits-all, and so I know that you have some ideas for that they would identify particular areas and that sort of thing. But if there were some signature activities that you kind of have in the works, it'd be kind of interesting to hear you talk about those.
Great. Sure. I mean, if you remember the chart that was up there, the requirements, if you will, the framework that we're working in is the one that we talked about. With the requirements are the partnerships, right? With the state, with the districts, with the partner provider program. And that's what's going to be common among all 7 of the programs that are redesigning. We looked for 6, we found 7, we couldn't decide, so we're currently negotiating with 7 programs. That's where the 7 comes from. So the requirements are around those partnerships. What people do within those partnerships is totally up to what the partners negotiate. So, but people have given us their preliminary thoughts in their proposals, and so we do have an idea. But the ideas don't come from us; they come from the universities. And I think we all are aware the university is the central organizer of all the partners. So. In one case, filling a gap that I think we all think exists, the districts who are involved are going to be funded to develop a leader tracking system so that the districts, on an ongoing basis and well after this initiative, are going to be able to provide the university with the data on those who've graduated from their programs. Universities are no longer going to have to try to do surveys for their graduates or in other ways, focus groups and other ways try to get that information. So the universities will have voice into the data that districts collect on their assistant principals, teacher leaders, whomever has graduated from the program. So clearly that's going to be a big element on the district side. On the university side, what we've done is and I want to stress how much we're learning along the way and how much we're modifying along the way. So when we read people's proposals, we said, wow, everybody's trying to do everything in the first year. A very ambitious group of folks. The universities have 4 years for this redesign. And so what we just have said to folks when we met with them this Monday is please pick a focus for year 1. We don't want you to try to do everything in year 1. And they said to us, that is very liberating. So they're choosing a focus. And that's that's kind of like the gift of the Magi, right? Where unless you articulate this, then everybody thinks they're doing what the other person wants. So we're going to do what we think Wallace wants, and we're going to do every single thing in the first year. And Wallace says, why are they doing every single thing in the first year? They should just pick one focus. So the potential foci or focus is they're choosing between things like analyzing their course content and their frameworks to see if new courses need to be developed or if courses need to be refreshed, if there's a coherence among all the courses according to a framework. So in one sense, and it seems to me, we haven't gotten this yet back from them, but it seems to be most of the programs are going to be starting off by doing that, analyzing their current scopes and sequence and seeing where the gaps are or where the need for revision is so that they can take advantage of their provider partner and others to help them in collaboration and partnership. So content would be one thing. Another focus would be the delivery of content, so instructional methods is another potential focus. Another potential focus, and at least one of the universities is going to have as its major focus the assessment of graduate outcomes. which is another reason why we would not prescribe this, because who would know that their state is embarking on a major effort on the in accreditation, and I think within ESSA as well, about graduate outcomes. And so it's perfect for this particular university to focus on graduate outcomes in the first year. Another potential focus is in clinical practice. And so the degree to which programs are clinically sound, including the internships that they may offer. And the last one is a focus on recruitment and selection, as we talked about earlier, as programs may go from, almost entirely self-selection on the part of candidates, many of whom are self-selecting because they want salary bumps and they don't necessarily want to be administrators. Then let's create teacher leader programs for those folks. So recruitment and selection is another. So those are the 5 big bucket areas that people are selecting one big bucket area to focus on in the first year. And if they have a second one, that's okay, but it has to, they have to do everything they want to do in the first big bucket area before bringing in a second, but no more than 2 in the first year.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And I know that the professional learning community structure is one of its purposes is then to share what one program is learning with the entire community, so that there is this ability to learn from one another as well as learn as they go with their partner district and exemplary program partner. And I was really pleased to hear that there are plans to have some larger conferences where programs that are not participating directly in the initiative can engage in somehow with the lessons learned through the project. We had a question from one of our listeners who was curious about the development of some sort of a what works type site, similar to the one that IES.gov provides, but related to administrator preparation. Has that ever been something that the Wallace Foundation has considered doing?
I think that we would consider our website in that regard.
Okay.
So I think there are two buckets here. If and when a research report has been vetted according to the criteria of the authors' organizations as well as Wallace, when it goes up on our website, it's because we think the evidence is meets our criteria for that kind of broad what works dissemination. It's not the what works clearinghouse. It's not that everything is required to be have a randomized control trial for Tier 1, for example. But I would say that and Rand will tell us in October, but I would guess that what we have up there on our website in education leadership is Tier 4 kind of evidence. So on one hand, I think that's a go-to source. On another hand, the work in progress stuff is not, which may be what the questioner is referring to, is not something you would find on our website, because it doesn't get onto our website until it's fully cooked and vetted. So the work in progress would be less available to the general public. However, I think there are ways, Michelle, that we can talk about availability to the UCEA community. And the other offer that I wanted to make as well, when you were talking about the professional learning community, is that if people are interested, to the extent anybody is interested in participating in a virtual professional learning community, which will be able to share some of these lessons on a more ongoing basis, we are talking about being able to create such a virtual professional learning community. So it would not have the advantage of people meeting in person, but it would have the advantage of a few times a year being able to share the lessons in real time without having to wait for the formal evaluation to be posted on the Wallace website.
No, that sounds really helpful. Yeah. In a little bit of a different direction, we had a question that's focused on the state and university context issue. Clearly, you are correct. Our audience seems to have a very keen sense of what you're talking about when it comes to some of the obstacles that are emerge when programs are trying to engage in some sort of a program change or improvement initiative. And one question was, and there are a couple of questions, so I'll give them all to you and you can kind of decide how you want to go forward. So one of the questions was, given these challenges, what made you, Wallace, decide that they wanted to take a chance and include those elements within this project? And then a second question is whether or not you have any strategies in mind for getting a sense of how to actually overcome any obstacles that you do discover.
Yeah, great questions. And I would comment to the first one that for many years, Wallace did not want to get involved in these matters, and what persuaded us differently was this is a different time and place, and the time and place now is one where we actually have the evidence for how important this is. We have some exemplars, including the ones that you call out in the publication with new leaders that we showed the slide of earlier. So the difference is the evidence is there, and if we do not move to the level of the universities and the states, we are not going to fulfill our mission for national scale and catalyze broad impact. So if you remember that that slide at the beginning for how Wallace conceives of its work as ultimately being broad impact and people who don't receive grants getting the benefit of the work, it was just really clear to us after all these years of we did state work in the first 10 years and then mostly district work in the last 5 years, and it just became really clear that we can learn lots of great lessons, and we are learning lots of great lessons from the districts, but that's not going to get us to national scale on improved principal prep. The only way to do that is through the universities and the states, and we feel that as distinct from 15 or even 10 years ago, that the evidence, in fact, is there to be able to do that. The strategies about how. So we've been talking about a professional learning community for the initiative. We are also going to have a professional learning community for the states. Let's assume for a minute that there are 7. By the way, each of the universities currently under consideration is in a different state. So if all of them wind up being members of this initiative, there'd be 7 states. So 7 states will be formed separately relatedly into a professional learning community with teams from the states. And they have committed to doing this in the request for proposals. So we have every reason to believe that should these 7 universities be selected, that their states have already committed to doing this particular work and participating in this particular professional learning community. And therefore, we would have very specifically the lessons from these 7 states. And, you know, as they share lessons with each other and as they develop exemplars. And that's one of the reasons, quite candidly, why we're not yet announcing who the 7 universities are and who their states are, because it's not a done deal yet. And if a state were to say, no, you know, we committed to it in the proposal, but we're thinking better of it, well, then unfortunately we would not be able to go ahead with a grant agreement for them. So anyone that we're going ahead with a grant agreement for has already agreed to participate fully in all these efforts. So we think we are going to learn a ton. And you know, 7 states is not a small number. And so we should be able to be learning lessons that are applicable for, you know, for other states, even though their contexts are different.
Well, that's super. We are, I think, probably getting towards the end of our time for the webinar. I did want to ask you one final question, and that's for quite a few people who I'm sure are wondering this, and that's, when do you plan to share the list of institutions that will be involved in the project?
We plan to share in the middle to about the 3rd week in September.
3rd week in September.
Yeah, which we would want everything to be 100% agreed to. So we would want all the universities to have completed grant agreements, you know, that have been signed by Wallace and the university. And so, you know, we think that's a realistic date, around the 3rd week in September.
That's super. Well, I want to provide you with a kind of an opportunity to say any last words with regard to this project or any of the things that we talked about today.
Well, I think your audience has heard quite a bit from me already. I would just close with my admiration. I would just like everybody on the webinar to understand how important what you're doing is. You know, I think it's easy to lose sight since you're not with children every day in classrooms. It's easy to lose sight of the impact that you're having and the degree to which that impact can be strengthened by doing this more continuous improvement process that, Michelle, you indicated your members are fond of. You're doing really difficult work in changing environments, changing roles of the principal, but it just could not be more important as a leverage point for teaching and learning for the nation's highest needs students. And so I guess wanted to end with my admiration and respect for you, Michelle, and UCEA as a whole, and your members and everybody who's on this webinar or listening to it. Thanks for everything that you do. It's a huge impact.
Well, we thank you as well, Jody, particularly for this really helpful overview of the Wallace Foundation's work in education leadership area and how that all led to the recent UPPI initiative. And you and I have talked about this before, but this is such an important opportunity for the field. You know, investments in the improvement of education leadership preparation are pretty rare, and yet they have, you know, to use Paul Manna's phrase, a multiplier effect. They impact principal candidates who go on to impact teachers and their students, and then when shared through professional learning communities, like the ones in the UPPI project as well as UCEA, such investments and improvement can impact other preparation programs as well. And it hasn't been since the Danforth's investments back in the 1980s that we've seen a project on the scale of the UPPI project. So I, for one, am very excited about this, and I know that there are at least 2 programs in the United States that continue to have Danforth in their name. So know that it's very likely that 35 years from now, you may have programs that are still harkening back to the important role that this particular initiative played in reframing how it is that they do their work. I have a few just last minute announcements to make before we end the webinar today, and because it's been definitely a fascinating discussion, and we want to thank Jody and the Wallace Foundation for allowing her to spend some time with us today, and also thank.
We're charging you. We're charging you. You didn't know that?
No, you didn't mention that. I'll put you in touch with somebody. And we also want to thank the Wallace Foundation for helping support our webinar series so that we can bring information and resources like the webinar today to UCA and the broader ed leadership community. For those who attended today's webinar, I'd like just to remind you that the full recording of the discussion is available, will be available on the UCA website and on our YouTube channel by next week. And if you have colleagues who are really interested in this project and or the other issues that we discussed today, we highly recommend you sharing it with them. And without further ado, we'll say goodbye to everybody and wish you a pleasant weekend and a wonderful July 4th. Thanks again, Jody.
Thanks, Michelle.
Bye-bye.